Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers play games from the past and discuss their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo, and I'm joined, by a man who has no problem with 7 hours and 20 minutes for his favorite pastime.
Brett Duville. We're going to just keep that World Series train rolling here in the intro, so I appreciate it.
When I heard about that game and the record, I was just like, really, that was one game, 7 hours and 20 minutes. Like, you got to be kidding me. As I will introduce our guest in a moment, but I'm not a sports guy, but Brett is, so I make fun of him a lot in that regard. I'm also excited to introduce our guest, Lulu LaMer, and she is actually, the cool thing about Lulu for this podcast is actually we have sort of a triple threat situation here because she's worked on 3 of the games we've talked about on the podcast. So Lulu started in 1998 at Looking Glass Studios, and she was working in QA at that time and moved up through to QA lead and actually worked on Thief the Dark Project, which was her first game in 1998, which is the previous game that we just played. Also working on Thief Gold, System Shock 2, Flight Unlimited, and up to Thief 2 as well, moving into an associate producer role on Thief 3 at the time. And then actually moved on to Ion Storm, where she worked also on Thief 3, which was Deadly Shadows, as a producer there, and moved into her production sort of role in her career. From there, from 2000 to 2002, and then in 2004, she joined at Crystal Dynamics and became a senior producer there, working on Tomb Raider Legend, and specifically Tomb Raider Anniversary, which I believe she was lead producer on, which you can clarify for me later on. And then moved on to 2K as senior producer, working on games like, as publishing producer, games like Spec Ops: The Line, also Borderlands, helping out with BioShock Infinite and Borderlands 2 as well. From there, moving on through various different roles, including Director of Studio Development at Phenomena, working with Robin Henneke, which is another great developer out there, and is currently a producer at Daydream Studios, working under Google on AR and VR stuff. So welcome, Lulu, so much to the podcast. We're really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think one of the obvious ways that we tend to start the podcast is very simply talking about sort of how you got into it and, a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background and getting into games, and then maybe kind of just an overview of some of your highlights from your early days in development. And then we'll get into the specific games a little bit. So how did it all begin for you?
Yeah, great. So let's see. I like you said, and thanks for the very complete intro, by the way. So I started at Looking Glass in 1998. I have a degree in French, which is really not useful for basically anything. I have no idea what I thought I was going to do with my life, but I had moved down to Boston with a friend of mine from high school who you interviewed, I believe, last week, Randy Smith. And I was temping at an insurance agency. And, Randy had said, once we start ramping up towards finishing, we'll start hiring QA testers. And it's really not hard to get hired as a QA tester. So, if that's what you want to do, you should do it. So I did. Yeah, really not hard to get hired. The first thing I did when I heard that I got the job, I went back to work to my temp job and quit. I shaved my head, bleached my hair.
I and some of those pictures online.
Yeah, and threw out all of my business casual clothes and kind of didn't look back. But great. I grew up playing games in the 70s and 80s. Like, we had a Pong machine at home because my parents had been pinball fans. They like to play pinball at the bar.
Yeah.
And it was a natural next thing. video games were. So yeah, we had a VIC-20 at home. My dad thought it was cool for us to play games and learn to write the really basic code that comes, for running really simple programs like making ASCII characters animate, stuff like that came in a little booklet with the computer. Yeah, we screwed around with all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I'd kind of always played video games, at least until I went to college, and then was like, oh, this is beneath me or something, until like somebody showed up with an NES, and then I was like, yoink.
Right back in.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it made sense to me. And I don't know, my dad's career advice was basically like, you can do anything. Just find interesting people who are doing something cool and help them do it, just kind of find what's interesting and get in there. You'll be able to find something to do, which is basically production in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's perfect. It felt like a perfect fit for what you ended up doing, empowering people to do just that. That's awesome. The Pong story specifically. You got. I know. Brett was working with mainframes. He's so old, so there's that. But I was definitely an Atari 2600 kid, but I didn't have a Pong machine, or VIC-20. So that's great.
I feel like we got the Pong machine like at a yard sale or something.
Oh yeah. Right.
Where I lived in the middle of nowhere in Vermont, like we were not exactly on the cutting edge of anything.
Right. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the. You said that it was easy to get hired at QA, and I think that is a kind of a weird thing, because it feels to me like QA is both an engineering discipline, because of course you're finding defects in software, and that takes a sort of approach that feels like engineering to me, being an engineer.
Yeah.
But also you're also the player advocate. So you have to have sort of psychology and sort of player brain and sort of a design brain as well. It feels like QA should be harder to hire for, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because there are people who are really good at it, and it's very easy to be bad at it. And at the player advocate part, I was so I loved what we were doing. I loved the game. I loved the atmosphere and the clubbiness of Looking Glass. And I was completely sold on the design philosophy, and even the development philosophy, sort of this data-driven approach. I thought all of that was so cool. I don't know. I was fully in. And so when we had real users come in and play, I was the first to be like, no, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Yeah, that was like, I mean, everybody has the story about the first time they watched people play their game and they were like, oh my God, no.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that happened so early in my career, because I don't think I handled it very well.
Yeah, it's a tough game to imagine introducing people to be honest, especially when it was in a rough state. I can imagine it being difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's so I mean, let's dig into the QA stuff specifically, because we'll want to hit both QA and production for you. But it's you get. Also coming from QA myself, you really get close and you kind of drink the Kool-Aid for how things are done, especially with the culture. In my case, being Lucas, the culture was very specific and different, both in QA and at the company. Mm-hmm. Dig more deeply into that sort of feeling that you had when you started, sharing it out, and how did you in a QA role and then eventually QA lead, guide the team toward how to be better at that? Because I completely agree with Brett. It is an underappreciated discipline within gaming.
Yeah.
So what were some of the sort of small or big revelations over the first few years of you kind of transitioning through, becoming kind of that quote unquote professional QA from just a play tester?
Honestly, I don't know if I was ever really professional QA,
Yeah.
The approach, like, I don't think we really got very sophisticated about it. There's a lot of difference between all of the levels in Thief, as I'm sure you experienced.
Yeah.
And not only because the designers had such different approaches, which of course is one of the things that's really great about the game and about Bethesda games, right? There's a lot of texture and a lot of feeling of ownership and a thumbprint on all of the levels, right? But the testers were also different. Each tester was dedicated to a designer and to a level. So the tuning is rather different, and the kind of expected play path is different as well, and sort of, because of course we were reporting issues like there's literally nowhere to stand in this level. So if some levels are a lot harder, I think the QA approach has something to do with that. And some of the testers were much more like jump and whack things with your sword, and others were super slow, methodical, all that kind of thing. So that was, I think, honestly, a bit unfortunate. And when we, basically the same QA team rolled onto System Shock 2 afterwards, and we broke it up a little bit differently. We kind of had, we did continue to break it up by level, and that game is perhaps even more all over the place. But we also did full playthroughs with each of us did full playthroughs with different play styles, so that when we got to the end of the game, we're like, I am so screwed because this thing that I'm trying to do is absolutely not possible anymore because you don't place this kind of ammo or whatever.
Right. Yeah. There's so many different, because of the progression systems in System Shock 2, I can imagine having basically broken player builds that are not possible to finish the game with. I mean, in development, obviously, by the time you shipped, I feel like it actually manages to do it pretty well.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are broken builds, but they probably have to do with going too wide maybe and not going deep enough in some skills or something like that.
Yeah, or even going too narrow, and particular exploits that were easier in the game that don't work out anymore later on in the game. I remember going to Dorian Hart, who was the level designer for the guts level.
Yeah, organics.
At the end, after I had finished a playthrough or nearly finished a playthrough, I was almost in tears because I'd been playing this game for whatever it takes to do a full playthrough as a tester, which is, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 hours. And I was like, my build's not supported anymore and I can't finish the game. And I was so upset. And he was like, this is a little too much for me right now. He was a little overwhelmed.
That's a really cool point that didn't occur to us to talk about with Thief, specifically the impact that a tester can have on a level, and in the tone and feel and pacing and like you said, balance of it. Because we obviously we had Randy on, so we talked about level design quite a bit, and being a next level designer, we talked about it in the series. But yeah, can you dig into some examples or anything you can remember, specifics, like to your point about balance and flavor, especially? It's really interesting to hear, how the style of the game's play style for some testers, like the sort of run and swing kind of testers is going to play a different level. Because this is my third playthrough, and I kind of experimented a lot this time, and tried to use the sword a lot more. And it was really interestingly different game to do that. But do you remember anything about sort of like how that kind of played out? And which levels did you focus on, any particular levels?
Yeah, I did. The Song of the whatever, the levels changed name in development, so I don't Bone Horde. That one.
Yep.
and one other, and I must have had one other, but I can't remember what it might be.
Yeah, down in the bone horde.
Down in the bone horde. Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, even if it's just that one.
That's the only one that I remember off the top of my head. But I was a very, very sympathetic player. Like I got the I really played along. I played the fantasy. So I was if everything went to shit. Oh, I remember the other one was the one where you go through. There's like a bridge where there's burricks on one side and skeletons on the other, and if you drop a fire arrow in the middle, you can get them to fight, and then you just waltz through unobstructed. I can't remember what that level's called.
I can't remember which one that might be the Lost City.
Yes, Lost City. Oh, no? I thought that maybe so. It's some ruined city. I don't know. Whatever.
Or it could be Cathedral, the Cathedral one.
No. Oh, the outside of the Cathedral before you get inside. Yeah, possibly.
I got it. Yeah.
Right.
So when you say sympathetic, what do you mean? So you're playing.
Sounds like regulatory capture to me, is what it sounds like.
Yes, totally. It is regulatory capture. Sympathetic player, as in really not. If chaos ensued, I would reload.
Yeah.
I wasn't a ghost player because a couple of the play testers are like, "Oh, did you know you can play all the way through without ever being seen in the slightest?" Which we started calling with Thief 2. We started calling by whatever the forum poster on TTLC through the TTLG through the Looking Glass. Who kind of started pioneering that style. I don't remember what their name was because
that's great.
20 years ago, but we started calling it that guy style.
That's a great anecdote that even back then using forums and listening to people, because it's talk about a diehard fan base.
Oh my God. They were really, I mean, after Looking Glass closed, they were constantly like pestering us. Like, did you take the source code? Can we have it? Always and even before Looking Glass closed, always pestering for any kind of information they could try to get out of us.
Right.
Yeah, there was some of that with LucasArts as well, with the adventure games in particular. Yeah. I mean, we didn't work on those games. But I definitely remember there being that kind of fan base for those as well. So although we didn't have any play styles named for any of them that I know of, so that's that's definitely an interesting tidbit. It was an interesting changing time that way because the internet was starting to become more widespread, and especially for college students who would have all had email accounts and availability. I can definitely see connecting more with those players at that time.
Yeah, it was sometimes a bit too intimate. They really kind of felt like they knew the developers, the designers, programmers as well, and would refer to them and talk to them like they knew them. And I remember it feeling like, do you actually? Or it was, I don't know, it was a little bit disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a unique. We've obviously with both games, and then we reference Looking Glass a lot as an influence because a lot of the point of the podcast is to talk about influences, right, and where the relevancy comes from, and so it comes up a lot. But they're so unique, and so many of the of the developers who worked on these games went on to influence so many other things.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of see why that sort of mythology of the studio and the individuals kind of came up from that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I feel like my entire career is based on the fact that I happened to work on these games. I mean, I feel like I said, I feel like I was pretty sympathetic to the cause and really got it. But at the same time, like, I mean, I was just in QA, right? On Thief, I didn't do much. I think my biggest imprint on the game is getting the balance, the economy changed, because Greg LaPiccolo walked by the QA pit at one point and heard me saying, "Yeah, you can't buy shit with the money that you get at the end of the levels." And he walked right over to the design pit, which is right around the corner, and he said, "Lulu said that you can't buy shit with the money that you get from the levels. Do we need to make some changes?"
That's awesome. That's great, especially because we had Greg on, so you have that anecdote. That's great. Yeah. Well, and that's I mean, you throw that out as one small thing, but I think it's actually a good example of a big thing.
I mean, inevitably it would have happened anyway, right? Like, I don't really take credit for it. It's just a funny story. But I mean, certainly it did something. But the point I was trying to make was that, having Looking Glass on my resume continues to have like outsized influence in my career.
Yeah, exactly. So two-part question really quick on the QA, and then I'd love to kind of start transitioning to some production stuff. And we both of us were curious and referenced this question, I think, as we were playing both games. And it's a two-part question because I'd love to hear a little bit about System Shock as well. And maybe you've hit it a little bit with System Shock on the sort of build problem, but what are for Thief and then for System Shock, what was an example of the difficulty of testing games like this? And the reason I bring that up specifically is because of Looking Glass's sort of approach that, like you said, you were all in on. But from a QA perspective, what was a difficult example? Do you know what I mean? Of kind of like debugging and trying to figure out how to iterate on something and give them feedback.
So the design or the data-driven approach, I think, probably made it easier to test because the inheritance model for objects and stuff meant that everything was basically going to behave in the same way unless it was overridden, right? So there was a fair amount of consistency. There weren't a lot of like single objects causing outsized problems. I mean, of course that happens sometimes, but I think that probably made it easier to test. Thief just was a huge amount of territory to cover, and I think that I remember whoever had Randy's cathedral level, spending so much time trying to break. I mean, that level is brutal.
I can imagine.
And
I can imagine on that.
But trying to break trying to get outside of the walls and point out every little area where you could like wiggle to get your physics model outside of the, right over the fence, particularly in the back area where the little guys, the monk that Randy plays his voice, he didn't tell us that. He didn't tell us that. Oh my God. Yeah.
I was wondering when I was playing it, I was like, wait a second, is that Randy?
Yeah, it totally is. I have great. Some other things for thee to do as well. You hear that line and you're like, are you fucking kidding me? I'm not going back in there.
Yeah, that's definitely like the fetch quest of the fetch quest.
Oh, God, yeah.
Section of the game. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was just going to mention I actually found a way to get outside of the walls while I was playing.
Yes, yeah. So it ended up not actually being that hard, and we reported bugs for every little spot where you could do it. And then eventually, Randy and Mock were like, you know what? Screw it. If you guys want to get out of the world, if you want to be a jerk and do that, go to town.
The old days.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas, so in terms of difficulty for testing, as soon as I started on Shock 2, I was like, oh no. Remembering the opening screen of System Shock 1, where there's the difficulty whole page where you slide difficulty for story, combat, whatever, all of this. And I was like, no, I don't want to make this test plan. So I was actually, pretty relieved when we ended up with only 4 difficulty levels for that game, and no extra sliders. But that
I
one
think
was
the sliders came in later as maybe they were in the configuration settings or something, because I think you can do that, but you have to know, like, and so it's probably not like officially supported or something like that.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah. Okay, right. And that was like you could just edit a text file to change that. And for both games, that was how basically everything was done. You know, Randy was talking about, I heard your podcast with him and Greg about the little monochrome monitor spewing debug info, which of course as QA testers we lived and died by. And when I went to a company that didn't do that, I was like, how do you know what's going on? I feel like I learned a lot about how game systems work by watching that monitor, and certainly learned all the language to use to describe problems. It was a wonderful educational tool. But you open a text file and then start the game. Make your little edits. Give yourself extra money, which the QA testers did all the time. I did not. I was like, oh my God, you guys can't do that. That's cheating. Yeah.
Great. So I and as I was prepping for your intro, I noticed there's one of the little bios that I read that I think you must have written, kind of comments on sort of your promotion to associate producer, in quotes, quote unquote. And so how did that transition happen for you? And we can start getting into some of the production side of it.
So on Thief 2, I forget, like, they needed production help. And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. I'd love to. And I can't remember what exactly I was doing. I don't really remember what I was doing. But one thing I remember was I don't know if I should tell you this story.
Sounds like a perfect story.
Yeah,
it sounds like you should. No, we can always edit it later if it.
I don't know. Maybe I'll skip it. I don't really remember what I was supposed to do as an associate producer, and honestly, like, communication at Looking Glass was really not very good, and so expectations were not really communicated very well. I know the one thing that they really wanted me to do was go on press tour, because we were on a pretty tight schedule to finish Thief 2, and they couldn't really spare any designers or project leads or whoever. And Greg had left. Greg, of course, would have been the right person to do it, because he's articulate and he's charming and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, he had left for Harmonix by that point. So they recruited me for, I don't know why, to talk to the press. Because I kind of understood the philosophy and could talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to a local Boston TV station and was on some live TV program talking about the game. That was weird. And then went to the UK to the least sympathetic game interview I think I've ever done with PC Gamer. I was talking to Kieran Gillen, and he was so totally unimpressed, or appeared to be so completely unimpressed with what we were showing. Because the difference between Thief 1 and Thief 2 is really not all that significant, right? We made a bunch more levels. We had 16-bit palette instead of 8. We had imported the sky from what's it called? Flight Unlimited. So there was this cool, whatever, at the time, really beautiful sky instead of just the pinpoint black. And the levels were way bigger, which was maybe not the best
Right. Not necessarily a
Not
good thing. Yeah.
necessarily a good thing, but it wasn't clear yet because the game wasn't finished. So Kieran Gillen, deeply unimpressed with the game at the actual interview. But then we went, all of the journalists, we all went, and me and the other press person from IDOS went to the bar, had a few drinks, and then it turns out that Kieran is this huge Looking Glass fan, and like we've kind of been friends since then. We ended up talking about punk rock and whatever, and he and Randy also have been close friends for a long time because of that interview. And I don't know, I think his like hostility, negativity towards the interview sort of, I don't know, crucible, something like that.
So then let's move into Ionstorm.
Ionstorm,
and where you essentially moved. You kept working with Thief specifically, right? And there, you went there directly as a producer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I had been starting work as a producer or associate producer or whatever on Thief 3. Especially working with the engine team because they were building a new version of DrawMed for Thief 3, which is crazy. Working with them because they were, continually behind schedule and trying to figure out how to get on schedule. But the time that I was doing that at Looking Glass was actually really short before the company closed. Abruptly, I was talking to someone from Telltale the other day, and I was like, I too have worked at a company that went out of business, offered no severance, and just kicked us all out the next day. At the time, it seemed like a lark, I guess, because I didn't have any family or anything riding on my continued employment. Yeah. A few weeks later, we talked to John Che in Australia. I did about moving out there to work on whatever game they were doing. I can't remember. Was it the superhero one?
Oh, I don't know. That was a while back.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. When they first started 2K Australia, I mean, not 2K Australia at the time, obviously, it was Irrational Australia.
Right.
Yeah. But decided that was not, moving to Australia was not what I really wanted to do. So I started talking to Warren about Ionstorm. Warren was pushing really hard to get the IP because he was an IDOS studio. And he went sort of full court press on me and Randy and Emil and Terry to try to get us to come out there. And I remember having had a couple conversations with Doug about like what producers do. I don't know where I learned this, but basically I had a bunch of language to talk about what producers do, in terms of creating an environment for people to do great work and kind of getting out of the way and providing what's needed so that people can focus and stay, hold on to the vision. So when people kind of lose their way phenomenon that I was familiar with already from working on in progress games, that you can, nudge them back in the right direction. So it was basically just on the basis of that understanding that the language to talk about it, and not really, I wouldn't have hired me is what I'm trying to say, that I got that job. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, so I had lived in Austin and I knew it was super cool, and I kind of was like, I relished the opportunity to move back there and keep working on Thief. So I was the first one from Looking Glass to accept that job, and kind of once I was in, Randy was in, and Emil was in, and then that was enough.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, would have been Freedom Force.
Freedom Force. There you go.
Yes. Yeah. It was there. I was trying to reach for it.
Good
It
job.
took me a while to get there.
I would never have done it.
I played that game quite a lot. I like that. So I think it was led by Jonathan Shea, right? He is who had moved down there. Yeah.
He's from there. He moved back home. He was the project lead on System Shock 2, as well as the lead programmer. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, cool.
Yep.
So it's interesting. Yeah, it's you kind of transitioned nicely into a question I was going to ask on just sort of like your approach and sort of philosophy around production. When you so it's good to know that you were sort of first looking glass hire for Ion Storm in that case. So do you have any memories for sort of that how you folks started taking Thief from as a concept and kind of and how you as a producer played a role in that to transition it over into Ion Storm and some of those tenets of Thief? Do you have any sort of memories of sort of you had the IP and which was great, and it transitioned over, and now there's going to get to be a third one. And then because you had been on the previous two, like what kind of philosophies kind of emerged, and how did you approach it?
Right. So Chris Carollo had come over too. He was sort of he ended up being the AI lead once Tom Leonard, who was the sort of original author of the Thief and System Shock AI. Once he moved to lead programmer, Chris took over as the AI lead. Chris also came over to Ion Storm, but to work on Deus Ex 2. So there were 4 of us. Which was actually really nice to have. But the first thing that we did when we got there was start working with the Deus Ex team on what kind of engine improvements we were going to make all together. We had a completely shared tech, because obviously, like, what's good for one game is going to be good for the other game. They are so closely related, really. And that was a weird process, because we'd come from working with totally different engines. The fact that Deus Ex managed to make that game out of Unreal just blows my mind, because once we started working with Unreal, we were like, what the hell is this? This doesn't do anything we want to do. So we were talking to, is it Tim Sweeney? Is that his name?
Yeah, Tim Sweeney. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Epic guys. And we were like, okay, so what we want to do is have this whole object system with inheritance properties, blah, 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 blah. And they were like, yeah, don't use Unreal for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do that. That was their guidance.
We've already written you a $500,000 check.
Right. Yeah.
Or whatever, something like that at the time.
Yeah, it was really, really expensive. So that was the first thing we did was a lot of engine work and a lot of figuring out how to get tools that we could actually work with. And then for folks who had come over from Looking Glass, learning how to use Unreal to make levels, because it was a completely different approach. Also, we had a lot of inherited folks from Ion Storm who we had to learn how to work with, and there was not really a lot of shared philosophy or shared really understanding of what the art should look like, or it was kind of a tough transition, because it was this like learning how to build a culture and not just like a work environment where we understand how to do our work, but also how the game should work, and all of those things. It was actually a really tough one.
Yeah, it sounds like you got thrown into the deep end of the pool as far as that goes, right? I mean, it's every possible challenge all at once.
Yeah,
a mixture of big challenges that any one of those could have been a really a big deal for a studio.
Oh, absolutely.
Or for remaking.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
Randy was the game director for that, right?
Yeah, he had been the game director for Thief 3 back at Looking Glass as well. He and Terry working together.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Okay. That's right. He did mention that. I wasn't sure how that transition happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as a producer in that situation, does that go back to some of your philosophy that you were talking about of how you, some of the words that you were using to describe the culture creation and so how did you help kind of foster that and move it forward?
Not well. I mean, I really didn't. Looking back, oh my God, I didn't know what I was doing at all.
None of us did.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just doing whatever I could, and ultimately, like, I don't know, it wasn't really working out for me very well. I didn't feel like I had the support that I was expecting to get from Warren as this, very experienced producer, sort of the mold that people expect for a game producer. I was expecting really to learn a lot from him. And of course, he had another job, right? As studio director. And, he was getting more and more engaged with cross studio stuff at IDOS and trying to be involved there. So I was really I just wasn't doing very well and didn't have any path to get better. I didn't have any help.
Mm-hmm. Mentorship.
That stuff. Yeah. So I don't think I really exactly realized that, but I did realize that I was pretty not happy being there, and that, like, the abstractness of the work was kind of exhausting. It's not work. It felt like there wasn't anything that I could do, which can be really frustrating and makes a lot of producers bad producers because they feel like they have to do something. So they interfere too much or whatever. But I knew that I shouldn't do that, but I didn't know what I should do instead. But that frustration of not having anything to do and not having really any direct control or agency or whatever was challenging for me. And so I quit to be a midwife.
Well.
All right.
Yeah, I left. Yeah, I just wanted to do something real for a while. And obviously, like, when I look back, it's like I had no idea what I was doing. I was totally failing. I didn't really have the mentorship needed to get out of there, out of that hole that I'd built for myself. And so I just, like, launched into space.
Something totally different. Yeah.
And to something completely different. I, like, worked with a friend to produce a short film, which was fun to do production in a totally different way. And I helped deliver a whole bunch of babies.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in the process, like, I came back into games because Doug Church had gone to Crystal Dynamics, and I ran into him at GDC, and he was like, we really need a line producer to get this project in order and really get shit moving. And I was like, oh, that's cool. So I started interviewing, and they were like, what in the world does midwifery have to do with video game production? And I was like, actually, I think I'm a much better producer now, because this skill of creating an environment where somebody can do hard work is exactly what midwifery is, right? You don't deliver the baby. The mom delivers the baby. You're just helping in this really particular way, right? You don't have a whole lot of specific agency. You have influence. So influencing without authority, right, is kind of the whole skill. And having seen people do that really well, delivering babies, I kind of got it a lot more, and started working at Crystal and was like, oh, I used to be terrible at my job. I get it now.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow. I did not see this coming. That's a great analogy. And I mean, obviously it's not the same thing, but that analogy is used so much, right?
Yeah.
And just how it is to create anything that's really difficult to create.
Tim also took a year off from video games to go into the woods. And someday I'm going to pry out how that influenced his skills as well, but that'll be a separate interview.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely did. That's great. That's really an interesting correlation between those two things. And to jump into Tomb Raider, which you naturally progressed to, and I'd love to hear. I think in pre-show you mentioned that the Tomb Raider, the original Tomb Raider, which we played before Thief, was the last game you played before you, as a civilian.
Yeah, that's right.
Before you shaved your head and dyed your hair. So maybe taking a step back, we'd love to talk about sort of how Tomb Raider's influenced you as a developer. And then the interesting thing about this story, especially your break, which I didn't know about, I was coming into Crystal myself. I was really impressed with the Tomb Raider Anniversary team specifically. Yeah. That leadership team was incredible. I'm still friends with Bada today. Oh, nice. And you and Andy and Jason were just like, you had it going. You just were a well-oiled machine from my outsider's perspective. So I would love to talk about that when you get to it too.
Sure.
But, so talk about Tomb Raider. Like what was your perspective on Tomb Raider, both the first one as well as kind of working at Crystal?
Yeah, sure. So I hadn't played a whole lot of 3D games because I didn't really have the machine for it, But I played Tomb Raider 1 it must have been on PC because we didn't have a PlayStation. But it was a really crappy PC, so at all the lowest settings, right? And that I really how much I loved Tomb Raider at the time has really become more evident as I've gone forward, and especially working on Anniversary, because I love the way that games create these spaces, these real places in your mind where you've been, where you've explored. And, when we were working on Anniversary, if we managed to evoke that place feeling that I had from 10 years before, then I knew we nailed it. Right. So I loved that feeling of just wandering around in this giant, God, that game is huge, giant game. And being lost, being so far underground, working really hard to make sense of the space so you could get back to the secret door that you saw when you pulled that lever, right? And I don't know, it was just kind of a spacey time, in my life, where just really engaged in that game. I also made some paintings about it.
Wow.
Because you get up really close to these textures, and then they're just like a really big square. Right. I guess I don't remember if the painting was about Thief or I guess it was about Tomb Raider, but I did this this painting of giant pixels and the muted palette, and lots of similar colors. I thought it was all really interesting and beautiful, and it was after going into games, it feels like such a naive perspective, and I kind of love that naivety because it's lost forever now. So because right after finishing that game, I feel like it was immediately after finishing that game that I went to work at Looking Glass and was like, oh, I see. Okay, Tomb Raider is this additive. It obviously uses this additive engine because these are just single planes making the spaces, and you can get to the other side of them, whereas Dramad was like a subtractive, so there is no other side. It's the vastness of you're coring out space from the center of the earth. Yeah. So,
So then, what when Doug talked to you
mhm.
about Crystal, I would assume that Tomb Raider was kind of in your inner being for as a game developer already because of
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
because it
totally.
was so was that must have been exciting to. So you probably went into work on Tomb Raider
I
Legend
did.
first,
That's
right?
right. I went to work on Legend. I think it had been in development for. I started interviewing at GDC and didn't start until June. So it had obviously been in progress at least that long, but probably maybe 6 months before.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it was the Soul Reaver team,
Right.
and Doug as the creative director. And as soon as I got there, it was clear Doug was having a really hard time getting the creative direction out to the team and trying to get through to this team who had worked on something very, very different, very story focused, that we wanted this more systemic approach. Honestly, like, I'm not sure that I really remember what the creative direction was, because there have been so many Tomb Raider games since then, and so many games sort of building on the changes that we made for Legend, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's it called? Uncharted came out
Mm-hmm.
between Anniversary and Underworld, and
Yeah.
was doing so much more of sort of what we had tried to do with Legend, taking that another big leap forward. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
hard
It
to
felt.
ambiguate all of those things going on at the same time. Of course, Richard LaMarchand, the co-creative director of Uncharted, had been working at Crystal up until right before
Yeah.
I started. I think he left a week before I started because his name was on all of the design documents. So I think he was working with Doug on Legend right before he left for Naughty Dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It's an interesting legacy there
Yeah.
too. I remember being impressed with Legend from a sort of distilling down Tomb Raider's essence, and if is one way I'd put
Yeah.
it, where there still was that sense of exploration and vastness, but it was just kind of distilled down and kind of concentrated or purified,
Right.
if you will,
Right.
and kind of taking out some of the cruft of things, but I mean, with Anniversary specifically, which
Yeah.
I referenced a bunch on the series we did with the
Mm-hmm.
original, uh, talk about that a little bit, because I want to make sure we hear some of that,
Sure.
because it's such a unique game, because it's one of the few. We've obviously had a lot of remasters over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still a trend. But Tomb Raider Anniversary and only a handful of others, I think we referenced the Ratchet and Clank remake
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. But this was a real
Yeah.
remake. I mean, this is like a from scratch. And to your point, the feeling that you felt in the
Mm-hmm.
original, and what you guys wanted to capture, you did. Like the cistern in Anniversary is actually better and my more favorite version of the cistern,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
even though it's a remade
Thanks
level.
for saying
The spirit is there.
that.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I told a lot of that all the
Yeah.
time. I mean, so do you remember the early days of Anniversary
Yeah.
and sort of how you approached looking at the
Yeah.
original?
So, after Tomb Raider Legend, I went and worked on this unannounced IP with what had been the Snowblind team. I started working on that.
Hmm.
And then the producer on Anniversary quit. And the team who I had worked with, of course, on Legend, it was like a splinter team. It was sort of
Hmm.
4 of the very best artists from Tomb Raider Legend, a designer, a scripter, and Jason Bada, splintered up to make this game. And the idea was like the 8 of them were going to bang out this game in a year. So a bunch of those guys came to me and they were like, okay, so Nate is leaving, and we think that you should take over. And I was like, okay, that sounds fun. So and I think it had probably just been a couple of months that I was
Would
working
that
with.
be Nate Wells?
No.
Okay.
Funny stories about Nate Wells. He was our roommate during System Shock 2.
Oh, okay.
Oh wow.
Man, the connections. Oh
He's
my
also
God.
from Vermont. Greg LaPiccolo, Randy, Nate Wells, and I are all from Vermont. Like everybody on the Thief team, it felt like. Anyway,
Yeah.
not Nate
Wow.
Wells.
Yeah.
He was still back in Boston working at Irrational. Nate Schomburg,
Oh, right.
who had
Okay.
been at,
Yeah.
who you guys might know from LucasArts, right?
Yeah.
He quit. I came to take over the team. Started working on looking at the schedules, and then realized that the schedule had been built so that level design alpha was at launch. So we actually had to bring the schedule in by 3 months to make time for, certing and beta and all those kinds of things. So we recruited another team to come and help with level design, level art, all that kind of thing. It was crazy. That was the craziest scheduling mishap I have ever seen in my life, and it nearly killed me. And everybody else on the team. We had to really, really just kill ourselves to get that game out. But it came out on time and on budget. We were like $4,000 over budget, and it was money that we'd spent on crunch food. So
yeah, I had forgotten how small that team was
well,
too.
yeah, it was. It was a small team. I mean, we also used the creative services team, of course, to make cutscenes. So it ended up being a little bit bigger than that, but it was really small. So the beginning of that game was basically this level designer from Tomb Raider, an old school Crystal guy called Kyle. I can't remember his last name. Played through the game. Played through Tomb Raider 1 again. I think Bada did as well. And then the two of them just roughed out the whole game in, sort of the loosest possible block mesh, just square boxes and tunnels. And sort of, it was crazy. It was like the whole thing was up and running in this total block form really, really early. And then it gave us a really good picture of where to direct our attention, identified immediately where the big rooms were, where the important spaces were, and which ones we could just cut or elide, let's say, because a lot of things were referenced, gestured at maybe, and mostly skipped over. So
right. Yeah, exactly. Especially like I used the reason it came up, I think, originally in our conversations in the Tomb Raider series when we were playing Peru. I think I used Anniversary as an example because, like you said, you folks distilled down sort of my memory of the original game.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sort of the feeling of it.
Yeah.
But it was just much more streamlined.
Right.
And it felt I still think, Brett, you haven't gotten to play it, right? You haven't gone back to it. Or Anniversary.
I'm not recently. I played when it came out.
Oh, you did? Okay, I forgot. Yeah.
I played the Wii version. I wanted to have Tim's excellent archaeology mini games.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot you worked on the Wii version. That's so funny. Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is exact. Like you're quoting me word for word from the press that we did. The point was to get the memory you're feeling from the game. From Tomb Raider 1, not to recreate it faithfully. Because when I went back and played it at the time, I was like, God, this game is boring.
The design sensibilities had definitely shifted for sure in third-person action adventure.
I mean,
and Uncharted is part of that, right? As well. So
of course, yeah.
Kyle Mannerberg was the
yes.
Yep. Excellent.
Yeah, he was wonderful.
Yep. It's interesting. I think that the audience would be interested to hear, if you don't mind, and
this will also probably be the last question because we're getting on an hour here, and then we'll want to give Lulu a little time to talk about what she's doing recently.
Yeah, we just have so many things we can
I
talk
know.
about, Brett.
My God. Every tangent.
Yeah, well, Lulu's done so much.
She has, yes. It's an amazing career.
Yeah, the interesting thing, and the reason that I wanted to ask this last question, and I mean, whatever aspects you think are useful to talk about, our audience, a lot of the audience members are not developers, or they're aspiring developers. So because we even had a veteran producer on before, you kind of threw out some things in there when it comes to scheduling and budgeting and stuff like that. And I know those aren't always the most exciting conversations or topics necessarily for people, but how do you as a producer, and specifically like some of your revelations about your early days as a producer, and then sort of like how you progressed of like, this is actually what, and I don't necessarily mean to get into the details of like, okay, let's talk about building a schedule or whatever, but I'm really interested and kind of delighted to hear you talk about how creating a safe sort of environment around the team is what a producer really needs to do. And to some degree, the production schedule and the budget is sort of a part of that in a way.
Absolutely.
Right? That security and
right.
staffing.
Having that structure gives people security not to worry about stuff. You want to take away as much cognitive overhead as you can so that people can use that brain attention to do the stuff that they care about and that they only they can do, right? So I think like building a schedule is like putting up this scaffolding around the project where you say, okay, we know that this is how much game needs to be made. And if we break it down appropriately into chunks, then this much needs to be done by this time and this much at that time. And that means somebody has to be responsible for all of these different chunks. And you just take it apart and make sure it's covered among lots of people. And then you can't really know literally everything that needs to be done to finish the game at the beginning, of course. All you can really know is how to get to alpha, which is where all of your features are complete, all of your level art is finished, all of the scripting is in so you can play through it. And then you have to move to a completely agile focused schedule where you just have your list of things that you want to get better. I mean, I don't know any better way to do this than to sit in a room with the designer, the artist, and maybe your game director or whoever else is above and owning, and write down every little thing that you want to make better and prioritize them and work through them and do it again a week later or 2 weeks later. Because as you play through that second or third time, you're like, you know what? We got 2 weeks left. I can live with that. But this, I really want to put some more attention into that. And the anniversary team was really amazing at that. They were all really passionate players. And they were it was mostly a level art team, right? But they were the most design focused artists that I've ever really worked with. They were so good. Those guys, I missed them for years. I mean, I didn't work with anybody who was better than them for a really, really long time. Because they could really see it as players, and approached the game, as people who cared and who loved playing games, not just who wanted to make it beautiful.
Yeah. That it's a good, the process you're talking about there post alpha kind of, I think we've referenced it a few times, but there's sort of that triage kind of process, right? That kind of comes out. And to your point, I think good production often helps guide the team toward what is important versus what seems important. If that makes sense, you know what I mean? Versus there is, Brett and I talk a lot about compromises, right? And about how, and obviously players can get, upset and frustrated with this thing that they say, well, why isn't this fixed, or why isn't this different, or what have you? But at the end of a project like that, there's a guidance that needs to happen
Right.
on, like you said, prioritizing and picking your battles.
Yep.
And focusing on the things that really ultimately will mean the most to the
Yeah,
player.
I mean,
even
this
though
is exactly
they don't
what
know it.
I did. Sort of my role at the very end of System Shock 2 was to sit with John Che, triage the bug list every day, and figure out where we needed to continue improving. And like, you know, I had played over the game. My team had played over the game hundreds of times, and so, you know, giving this guidance on what was most important and what kind of rose to the top. That was my first real production experience, and that's where I learned basically everything that I do.
Yeah. And not a better game to learn on too.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Lulu.
let's. I'd like to. We were talking a little bit pre-show, even before Tim joined us, about what you're up to lately with Google via, I guess Tim said Daydream Studios or Daydream whatever Incorporated.
It's a division of. Is it a division of Google, or is it just sort of like what the product?
Daydream is the product area. See the air quotes. That explores augmented and virtual reality at Google. It's like our team code name, right? But it also happens to be the name of our VR headset product. So it's confusing for everyone inside the company and outside the company. So I work in Daydream at Google on a team called Immersive Arts. We're basically an art team, tech art, animation, that kind of thing. And we make stuff because AR and VR needs a lot of 3D stuff in it. And we sort of do visual design and a lot of feature design for what that stuff is, what we can imagine it to be, and how it behaves and how it looks, of course. So we just launched something called Playground, which is a camera mode in the Google Pixel phone that allows you to place interactive characters in camera space, in augmented reality, right? And they react to your face and your sentiments in both in third person, outward facing camera, as well as in selfie mode. The big feature is that you can take a selfie with Iron Man. Virtually standing behind you. Yeah, it's cool. It's a fun team to work on, and working at Google is a trip, man. It is quite different from video game development.
Yeah, certainly what we've heard, because we have colleagues from LucasArts who ended up there. Andrew Kermsey, who we mentioned several times, he's not there anymore. But yeah, well, that's very cool, and I look forward to seeing that. The AR space is super interesting to me. As a consumer, I think I don't know that it's something I necessarily want to work in for my own kind of
one of the inspirations for me for working in AR is, again, going back to Tomb Raider and this creation of spaces in your mind and the way space plays with memory. I think augmented reality is really interesting because you put something in AR and you see it in the context of your space and you remember it as though it were really there.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. I've been reading about reading. I read a lot, and I'm also meta reader because I read about reading, and it ties in spatially as well. And one of the reasons why physical books are still great is because you can spatially locate where you had the experience of reading the thing, like in the space of the book, right?
Yeah, I can't read books on Kindle or whatever unless they're total pot boiler page turners. If I want to remember anything, if I read a physical book, if there's a word that I've never encountered before, I'll remember where it is on the page and where it is in the depth of the book.
Right.
But if I read it in e-reader, it's totally lost. I don't remember the word. I don't remember the definition. I don't remember what's happening in the story. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And so that is why AR is really interesting to me, is just kind of like how it uses our existing,
right,
evolutionarily determined, survival stuff, systems basically in our brain to do that. So I really look forward to your future work.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks so much, guys. This was really fun.
Thanks for coming on. That was, I mean, I feel like I wish you lived nearby so we could have coffee once a week and I could get all these stories again and again and again, because there's so much good stuff here. We could have gone all day. So thanks so much, and thanks for sharing sort of the roles you've had on these games that we've played. That was just terrific.
Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Lulu. Thanks for coming on.
Bye.
Welcome back from the break. I am so thrilled that we got to talk to Lulu. I said there at the end that I would love to pick her brain on a weekly basis, because just the stories and the experience, and also just seeing a person grow like that and have somebody reflect on how they grew is really terrific.
It's a good point. We haven't had a lot of that, actually. We've talked about moments, like projects and moments in time for people, and occasionally we get into sort of like that learning process and that sort of, if you will, like character arc of somebody's career. But it was actually kind of cool to hear her a little bit on the fly, I feel like, too, of like kind of, realizing sort of some of the growth that she went through as a producer. And on a really, she nailed it at one point. She mentioned sort of the intangibility of it or something like that.
Yeah.
And
the
abstraction, right. And production is like that. I really feel for producers sometimes in that regard. And it's just a really unique discipline that is, like she says, it's kind of under the radar, so to speak, but also critical.
Right.
So it's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, she's driving the snowplow or whatever, to clear out everything out of the way, and basically, it's a special skill. And I wish we had a producer on sooner, but I'm so glad that we got
a 3-in-1.
Yeah, really. I know, amazing.
Made up for lost time with Lulu alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to turn the page finally now on Thief. We're going to turn the page on the scroll, I guess. I don't know, whatever those in-game books were.
Yeah.
And we're going to turn to a game that we've actually had some suggestions on both Twitter and via email. And this one comes up frequently and has over the last couple of years. It's a weird one for us to approach because neither of us like the tone of the game. And that probably gives it away already. But it's a game that we have to wrestle with because its shadow is so very long. And that is Grand Theft Auto 3. I know that you are. I can remember the first time we saw this together at LucasArts in the level design area. We had that couch that everybody could play, the latest build on for Starfighter or whatever. And somebody brought it in and was playing it on that TV. And you were like not enthused by all the mob stuff, so you hopped into an ambulance, as I recall.
Well, and not only that, I mean, do you remember we had the game theory club that we created at one point, right? And that was one of the games that we sort of like, quote unquote, studied a little bit. And my solution to the tone that I just really, we'll get into it in the podcast, but not only that, but I was one of those guys that tried to obey all the traffic laws as well.
And then that is definitely something we'll talk about, because that's actually one of the things I find genius about the beginning of that game. So we'll probably talk about it even in the first episode.
And
I don't want to spoil that discussion, but I definitely have very strong feelings about that.
And to further clarify not clarify, but to exemplify my sort of conflict with this game and this franchise in general and the tone of things, I haven't finished it. I played a little bit of it back then when it came out, when we were all playing it. but I never went back to it. I tried to play Vice City and get further in. I did get further in that one because I the Miami Vice kind of feel I thought might work for me. But I also didn't finish that one. So full disclosure, I have never finished a GTA game of any kind. And those are the only two that I've actually started. So this will be a weird, conflicted ride for me.
I have actually finished GTA 3 fairly recently, within the last, I'd say, 6 years, 7 years, something like that.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
I've had it on the PS2. It's been on my PS2 unfinished shelf forever, and I went and I wrote about the experience. I also played a little bit of 4, and will not play 5, and we can talk about all of those things and why. But of course, this is in connection with Red Dead Redemption 2 coming out, and so that gives a whole bunch of other things that I think we probably need to talk about and wrestle about the industry as well, and kind of our own history with crunch and labor and all that stuff. So there's a lot of topics that are going to come up when we discuss this game, both from the design, but also in the circumstances surrounding its creation. So,
yep, should be fun.
Should be fun. It'll be something. I will put out on Twitter this week how many missions we'll play. It probably won't be a ton to start because we'll be setting it in its time and all that stuff, and we'll play a few missions. I know we want to at least play to this, the policeman's ball mission, I think is at least as far as we want to play, is my recollection, which is pretty early. It's probably no more than a couple of hours in. So we may need to play more than that to get through it. So I'll have to see. But check that out on Twitter at @DevGameClub, where you can also find Tim at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
We didn't have any additional feedback this week, but you can shoot that to us at devgameclub@gmail.com, or, of course, shoot us on Twitter. I will occasionally be still streaming. You can find me on twitch.tv/Brett Duville, no underscore there. Lately, we've been playing Resident Evil 7, and before that, a little bit of the most recent Thief. Yeah, it's been fun. I'm going to get back to it this afternoon. I may be done that by the time we play, so I will probably play Grand Theft Auto 3 all on stream as well. I'm set up to do that. So you can see me and my wacky escapades of getting to 5 stars there. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you really enjoy that interview. Maybe listen to it 2 or 3 times. I will hope you all have a good time playing games this week. Good day.
Good day.